In 1996, John MacCormack, a journalist with the San Antonio Express-News, began looking into the 1995 disappearance of Madalyn OHair in Austin, Texas. OHair was the founder of American Atheists and was responsible for the lawsuit that led to the 1963 Supreme Court ruling to end Bible reading and prayer in public schools. She was deemed the most hated woman in America, and because of this, when she disappeared with her son John and granddaughter Robin, there wasn't exactly public outcry to get to the bottom of it. After all, there was a note posted to the Atheist Center door reading, "The Murray OHair family has called out of town on an emergency basis. We do not know how long they will be gone at this time." MacCormack began conducting interviews and going over the little-known details, preparing to write his anniversary piece on the paper. Initially, he came up with little more than he already knew. Simply, they disappeared. 3 months later, he received a tip to look into tax forms filed by the Atheist Center, and he discovered that a transfer had been made in the amount of $600,000 from New Zealand. This promoted MacCormack and an investigator he was working with to check the OHair's phone records during the time of the transfer, which led them to a small jeweler in Fredericksburg, Texas, where the money had been sent, but there weren't any leads from there. MacCormack continued to search the case and got a tip in 1998 that the trio had been kidnapped and held at gunpoint in San Antonio by a man known as David Waters. MacCormack discovered that Waters was a former employee of the Atheist Center and had stolen $53,000 of their funds in 1993. He also had a deep hatred for Madalyn. The same tipster mentioned Danny Fry as being connected, coerced by Waters to travel to Texas from his home in Florida to help with the kidnapping, and not being seen or heard from since. In 1998, MacCormack wrote a piece for the paper illustrating Fry's connection to Waters and their possible connection to the disappearance of the OHairs. Just 2 months after the article was published, human remains were found near a river in Dallas. With some convincing from MacCormack and Danny Fry's family, police were able to test the DNA and confirmed that the remains did indeed belong to Danny Fry. Waters maintained his innocence, stating that he had not seen the OHairs since a year before they decided to make their move. Investigators, however, saw through Waters' story and the FBI arrested him, along with a man named Gary Carr, for the disappearance of Madalyn, John, and Robin. Eventually, Waters would confess and lead investigators to the family's remains and the partial remains of Danny Fry. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and later passed away due to lung cancer. Without MacCormack's persistent journalism and interest in the case, the mystery surrounding the most hated woman in America may have never been solved. Number 4. In 1972, a scandal emerged when 5 men were arrested for attempting to break into the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex, just a mile from the White House. An article published by the Washington Post on June 18, 1972, titled "5 Held in Plot to Bug Democratic Offices Here," piqued the interest of 2 fellow reporters at the Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodard. The pair learned from law enforcement that the 5 men in custody had worn surgical gloves and were carrying thousands of dollars in cash and had come from Miami. They also discovered that one man, James McCord, was on Nixon's payroll. In light of the articles being published by the Post, Nixon began secretly discussing with the CIA how to stop the FBI from investigating the burglary. Less than a month later, Woodward and Bernstein reported that the grand jury had sought the testimony of 2 men who had worked for Nixon in the White House. Both men, E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA agent, and G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent, would be arrested for guiding the burglars into the Watergate building by walkie-talkie from a hotel room across the street. Soon after, it was discovered that in Miami, $25,000 had been deposited into one account of the burglars, Maurice Stans, who just so happened to be the former Secretary of Commerce and served as Nixon's chief fundraiser. Bernstein, with the help of a confidential source within the FBI, known only as Deep Throat, continued to publish articles as the story unfolded. This included a piece on John Mitchell, the Attorney General, who controlled secret funds to gain access on the Democrats, as well as bringing to light that Nixon's aides had funded a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage during Nixon's re-election efforts. The White House called the Post biased and misleading, and much of which Bernstein and Woodward reported was ignored. During the trial to persecute Hunt, Liddy, and Stans for their involvement in the case, Hunt repeatedly asked the White House for money, believed to be hush money to keep them quiet about the president's knowledge or the involvement in Watergate. This prompted Judge John Sirica to use his tough-talking approach to his advantage, to get Hunt and 2 other burglars to plead guilty while McCord and Liddy went to trial where they were ultimately found guilty as well. Hunt's continued demands for hush money led John Dean, a White House lawyer, to confide in Nixon that there was a cancer on the presidency. Eventually, when the FBI infiltrated the White House in 1973, Dean himself, along with 3 of Nixon's top aides, were arrested. Amidst the Watergate scandal, Nixon was re-elected in 1972, taking the presidency by a landslide, only to be forced to resign when faced with certain impeachment and removal from the office in 1974. Had 2 brave journalists not taken on the story, the details, and corruption stemming from the White House at the time, it may never have been brought to the attention of the public and may never have been pieced together in a way that would eventually end Nixon's presidency. Number 3. Shortly after Larry Wellborn joined the Orange County Register in 1974, he was introduced to Linda Cummings, a woman who was thought to have taken her own life in an apartment building. He drove past every day on his way home from work. Despite the building manager, Louis Wychecki's suspicious behavior and his ties to Cummings through their mutual employer, the Doctors Hospital, the case would have closed and there would have been no further investigation. Just 6 months later, Wychecki was convicted when the remains of another woman were found in his apartment building. Cummings' body was then exhumed and tested. Both women had been subdued by thorazine, but even this was not enough for police to look into Cummings' death. Wellborn took it upon himself to conduct interviews with friends and family, including Linda's stepmother and best friend and co-worker, Harriet Neves. Harriet informed Wellborn that she was the last person to see Cummings alive at approximately 9:10 that evening at her apartment where she was having coffee with Wychecki. Harriet left at 10:35 with Wychecki, who dropped her off at home on his way to pick up his wife, Sandy, who also worked at the Doctors Hospital. Upon arriving home a little after 11 p.m. with her husband, Sandy said that their telephone began ringing, and Wychecki told her it was the fire station across the street, asking him to answer phones until 6 a.m. so the volunteers could rest. The fire department denies this phone call took place, and Wychecki returned home by 3 a.m., stating he was exhausted and went straight to sleep. The next morning, when Cummings had not been seen or heard from by noon, the couple went to investigate. They could hear the alarm, but no one would come to the door despite their persistence. Wychecki used his master key to enter the apartment and found Linda Cummings deceased in the bedroom. When police arrived, he stated that Linda was depressed and that he'd worried about her state of mind. This is argued by those close to her as she was settling into a new and happy life. In the 90s, with DNA advancements, Cummings' body was exhumed for the second time in hopes of tying Wychecki to her case. Unfortunately, the results were inconclusive, but District Attorney Larry Yellen believed Wellborn's work on the case, consisting of more than 60 interviews, photos, and circumstantial evidence that was enough to issue a warrant for Wychecki's arrest. On December 7, 2005, Wellborn watched as a SWAT team in Henderson, Nevada arrested Wychecki, who had since changed his name to David Stanley. Wellborn published an 8-part series on Linda Cummings and what really happened that day in January of 1974. His quest for the truth in Linda's case over the span of 3 decades resulted in justice for Linda, as well as a sense of closure for her friends and family. Number 2. On October 15, 2009, a homemade helium balloon shaped like a flying saucer sailed across the skies of Fort Collins, Colorado. Minutes after its departure from the backyard of Richard and Mayumi Heen's home, Denver NBC and KUSA-TV received a phone call from the family stating that their 6-year-old son, Falcon, was in the balloon's basket soaring thousands of feet above the ground. They requested news helicopters help track him down and bring him home. It wasn't until they spoke with the news stations that they called 911 to report the incident. The balloon eventually landed 2 hours later, and the boy was nowhere to be found. Search and rescue crews were deployed later that day, and CNN reported that Falcon had finally been found, hiding in the family's attic. Later, when Falcon was asked on the Larry King live show why he hadn't come out of hiding, he looked at his parents and said, "You guys said that we did this for the show." The following day, Falcon became physically ill when asked by reporters about the event, prompting an investigation. The Heens had been featured on reality TV show Wife Swap twice. Robert had made it clear to producers during that time that he wanted to pitch his own reality TV show. In light of the balloon incident, producers halted production on the family's episode, not wanting negative publicity that surrounded the family at the time. Robert and Mayumi were both found guilty in connection with the hoax, but they still deny it to this day. Number 1. Billy Jensen is an investigative journalist who has taken to social media to solve various crimes across the US. In 2016, Jensen used Facebook to create a page dedicated to Juan Vidal, who had been gunned down during an attempted robbery in El Monte, California. Tips began to flood in, and Jensen was able to piece together what happened to Vidal and hand the information over to authorities, essentially solving the case. That same year, in August of 2016, Jensen again took to Facebook in hopes of identifying a suspect seen in video footage walking to and from a crime scene where the young man's life was ended in Chesapeake, Virginia. The post was viewed and shared hundreds of thousands of times in the area, and tips began coming in. Jensen was led to a man named Darius Coupland and his sister, DeQuashia, who had dated and had a child with the victim. Later, an address was relayed to Jensen, who gave the information to police, who arrested the pair for their crime. Jensen continues to work tirelessly on unsolved crimes, using his own money to ensure his post on social media reach as many people as possible in hopes of getting justice for the victims. He also co-hosts a true crime podcast with a retired detective, Paul Holes, putting focus on cold cases that need a fresh set of eyes and effort in order to be solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.